The desert had always called to me, promising clarity in its vast emptiness. After months of sleepless nights and grief that clung to me like a second skin, I needed to escape. My sister's death had left a hollow ache, one I couldn't outrun, but maybe I could find solace, or at least distraction, in solitude. That's how I ended up at Cathedral Gorge State Park in Nevada, nestled in a remote stretch of rugged cliffs and cavernous canyons. Driving my RV through the winding dirt roads, I felt the weight of civilization peeling away. The sharp, jagged formations of the park rose like ancient monuments, their deep shadows stretching as the sun dipped toward the horizon. My chosen campsite was isolated, perched near a cluster of narrow slot canyons that the park was known for. The stillness was unsettling in its perfection. No car engines, no distant hum of electricity, only the occasional rustle of wind cutting through the gorge. By the time I parked, the sun had bled into the horizon, casting the canyon walls in hues of orange and crimson. I stepped out to stretch my legs, inhaling the sharp, dry scent of sagebrush. The air was crisp, the sky clear enough to see the first stars beginning to prick through the fading light. Everything about this should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. There was something heavy in the atmosphere, a silence that wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, almost watching. Brushing off the unease, I busied myself setting up camp. The fire crackled softly as I settled into a folding chair, staring at the stars above. They were brighter than I'd ever seen, an endless expanse of light scattered across the black void. The wind, which had been soft and soothing at first, began to change. It swirled unpredictably, whistling through the rocks and canyons with an almost melodic quality. I told myself it was just the acoustics of the place, but there was something oddly human about the way the sound twisted and carried. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like distant voices muffled by the wind. I turned my head sharply, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the endless stretch of desert rock. I laughed nervously, shaking off the feeling. "It's just your imagination," I muttered, retreating into the RV and locking the door behind me. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder once I was inside, persistent, insistent, and strangely articulate. I pressed my ear to the window, trying to make sense of the words, but the moment I strained to listen, they would fade into nothingness. My pulse quickened and I pulled away, shutting the blinds and turning on the small overhead light. For a long time, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door, waiting for a silence that never came. I told myself I was just tired. Grief does strange things to the mind, doesn't it? The next morning, the desert seemed less intimidating under the warm glow of the sun. I stepped out of the RV, determined to shake off the unease from the night before. The sky was a bright, unbroken blue, and the air carried the familiar scent of dust and sagebrush. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my notebook and camera, deciding to explore the trails that wound through the park's famous slot canyons. The path was rugged, weaving through towering cliffs that loomed overhead like ancient sentinels. The deeper I ventured, the more the desert's stillness enveloped me. My boots crunched on the rocky ground, the sound echoing faintly between the narrow walls. At first, the silence was comforting, a welcome reprieve from the constant hum of the modern world. But as the minutes stretched on, it began to feel unnatural, too complete, as if the world around me were holding its breath. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a dry creek bed. The stones here were smooth and pale, polished to a shine, as though water had shaped them for centuries. But the creek itself had long since vanished, leaving behind an eerie, desolate landscape. As I knelt to inspect one of the stones, I noticed something carved into its surface. Circles, spirals, jagged lines, patterns that seemed both deliberate and chaotic. I traced a finger over the grooves, wondering what they could mean. Petroglyphs, maybe? But they didn't resemble any I'd seen in books or museums. These markings felt wrong somehow. A sudden gust of wind broke the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. Then I heard it again. The whispers. They weren't carried by the wind this time. They seemed to emerge from the rocks themselves. Low, guttural murmurs rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost like speech. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's just the wind," I whispered aloud, as if saying it could make it true. The whispers grew louder, shifting in tone, almost as if they were laughing at me. I stood quickly, my pulse racing. My shadow stretched long across the stones as I turned to leave, but a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision stopped me cold. I snapped my head toward the canyon wall, but there was nothing there, just shadows pooling in the crevices of the rocks. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the carvings and the eerie atmosphere were getting to me. Forcing myself to breathe steadily, I pushed forward, determined to finish the loop trail. But with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't the kind of paranoia you could rationalize away. It was palpable, like unseen eyes boring into the back of my neck. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. I glanced at my watch, frowning. 4 hours had passed, but the loop trail shouldn't have taken more than 2. How could I have lost so much time? The RV greeted me with its familiar metallic hum, but something about it felt off. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the canyon, I noticed them, scratches. Long, deep gouges scored across the side of the vehicle, as though something with claws had raked them down the metal. My breath hitched, and I instinctively scanned the area around me. Nothing moved. No animals, no people, just the oppressive quiet of the desert. My mind raced. I hadn't seen these marks when I parked yesterday. Whatever had done this had to have been here while I was hiking. But there were no tracks, no disturbed dirt, nothing to suggest another presence. Trying to keep calm, I reasoned it must have been a coyote or some other animal, though I'd never known any desert predator to leave marks like that. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and checking all the windows. The RV felt smaller than ever, its walls closing in around me. As I tried to focus on making dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The whispers began again, faint and indistinct at first, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. I froze, knife in hand, straining to hear. The sound didn't seem to be coming from outside, it was inside. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I turned slowly, scanning the dim interior of the RV. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, pooling in the corners like ink. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, though the words were still impossible to make out. It felt as though they were circling me, drawing closer with each passing second. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice sounded small and shaky, swallowed up by the oppressive atmosphere. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the RV into a silence so profound it was deafening. For a moment, I thought it was over, until a loud thud echoed from the roof. I jumped, heart hammering in my chest. Something was on top of the RV. Grabbing the flashlight from the counter, I hesitated, debating whether to investigate. The roof creaked, as if under the weight of something heavy. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I edged toward the door. Before I could open it, the thudding stopped. The only sound was my ragged breathing. I backed away, locking every latch, and sitting down at the small table with the flashlight pointed at the door. The silence pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. My gaze flicked to the window, and my stomach dropped. There, pressed against the glass, was a faint handprint, too large and too distorted to be human. It lingered for just a moment before fading, as though evaporating into the air. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind, felt like an impending attack. Something was out there, or worse, already in here. The next morning, I stepped outside hesitantly. The desert around me bathed in pale morning light. My breath caught as I inspected the RV. The scratches from the night before were even deeper than I remembered, and new ones marred the other side, longer, angrier, as though something had circled the vehicle overnight. The dust on the ground was undisturbed, with no tracks to explain the damage. It was as if whatever had caused this had left no physical trace. Determined not to let fear paralyze me, I decided to spend the day exploring again. The open desert felt safer than the stifling confines of the RV. With my notebook and camera in hand, I retraced my steps to the dry creek bed, where I'd found the strange carvings. The air was different today, thicker, heavier, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. As I approached the creek bed, I stopped in my tracks. There was something new. a figure stood near the carvings, its back turned to me. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone who'd wandered into the same remote area. But the longer I stared, the less human it seemed. Its form was skeletal, draped in tattered fabric that swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel. "Hello?" My voice wavered, and the figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all. For a moment, I considered retreating, but my curiosity won out. I stepped closer, one foot crunching against the gravel. The sound was deafening in the silence, and the figure's head snapped around. Its face, or what was left of it, was a hollow void. Eye sockets stared back at me, empty and yet seething with a rage that sent a shiver down my spine. Its mouth opened, and a scream unlike anything I'd ever heard erupted from its gaping maw. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration, a force that seemed to rattle the very ground beneath me. I stumbled backward, my knees threatening to buckle. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the canyon and carrying whispers that grew louder and more distinct. Evan. My name. It was my name. The sound of my name carried on the wind, twisting and warping as it echoed off the canyon walls. The figure before me didn't move closer, but its presence felt like a weight pressing against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. My instinct screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Instead, I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze from the hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. The whispers intensified, no longer a disjointed cacophony but a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the next. Evan, you let her go. You left her. My heart sank. They weren't just calling my name, they were accusing me. Of what, I didn't know, but the words cut deep, each syllable sharpening the ache of guilt that had lingered since my sister's death. The figure tilted its head, its skeletal hand rising slowly to point at me. My feet finally found movement, and I staggered back, nearly tripping over the uneven ground. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The wind whipped around me violently, carrying sand and grit that stung my face and blurred my vision. When I blinked the dust away, the figure was gone. The canyon stood empty, eerily quiet, as if the desert itself had gone still. My breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The carvings on the stones glowed faintly, their strange shapes pulsating with a dim, otherworldly light. The whispers grew louder again, angrier now, and the air around me turned cold, unnaturally cold for the desert. I turned to flee, but the path behind me was gone, swallowed by shadows that crept along the canyon floor like living tendrils. Panic surged through me, and I bolted in the only direction left, deeper into the canyon. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was trying to pull me down. The whispers followed, surrounding me, accusing me. You let her die? You didn't save her. You're guilty. The words stung, dredging up memories I had buried deep. The hospital room, my sister's weak smile, the last time I saw her before the accident. I stumbled into a clearing, the narrow canyon walls opening into a small, circular space surrounded by towering stone formations. In the center was something I hadn't seen before, a small pile of stones arranged in a circle with a bracelet resting on top. My heart stopped. It was her bracelet, the one she had worn every day since she was a teenager, the one she was wearing when A chilling realization hit me. This wasn't just the desert playing tricks on me. It wasn't random. Whatever was happening here, it knew me. It knew my guilt, my pain, and it was feeding on it. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. I turned slowly, and there it was again, the skeletal figure, now just feet away, its hollow eyes burning with rage. The skeletal figure stood impossibly still, its empty sockets fixed on me with an intensity that felt like it could pierce my soul. The footsteps I had heard were gone, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. My heart thundered in my chest as the whispers swirled around me, louder and more insistent than before. You let her die. You didn't save her. The words were no longer just haunting. They were knives, cutting deep into the wounds I had tried so hard to ignore. I staggered backward, my heel catching on a loose rock, nearly sending me tumbling to the ground. The pile of stones and the bracelet caught my eye again. My sister's bracelet. The one I had bought her for her 16th birthday. its delicate silver charm engraved with her initials. It was impossible. I had buried her with it. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice raw with fear and frustration. The figure didn't answer, but it stepped closer, its bony hand reaching out. The whispers became a roar, a cacophony of voices screaming over each other, filling the air with accusations. The figure loomed over me now, its mouth opening into an impossibly wide scream, though no sound escaped. The energy around it vibrated with raw, terrifying power, and I dropped to my knees, unable to hold myself upright. My gaze locked on the bracelet. Something inside me, call it instinct, desperation, or guilt, told me what I needed to do. With trembling hands I reached out, grabbing the small silver band from the top of the stone pile. It was icy cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer for years. Clutching it tightly, I turned back to the figure. "I'm sorry." The words burst from me, carried by the force of everything I had been holding back for months. I couldn't save her. I tried, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to fix it, how to fix her. My voice cracked, tears streaming down my face. "If this is what you want, take it. Take it and leave me alone." I held the bracelet out toward the figure, my hand shaking so violently that the silver charm rattled against my palm. The figure froze, its hollow gaze shifting to the bracelet. The air around me changed, still cold but no longer biting. The whispers quieted, fading into an eerie hum as the figure reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against the bracelet. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself held its breath. Then the figure's touch lingered, and a single tear fell from its empty socket, trailing down its hollow, cracked face. It dissolved into the air, carried away by a sudden gust of wind. The whispers were gone, the shadows receded, and I was left alone in the clearing, clutching the bracelet to my chest, trembling from head to toe. But the feeling of being watched never left. The clearing was eerily quiet after the figure disappeared, as if the desert itself had gone to sleep. My chest heaved, each breath a struggle as the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me. My fingers still clutched the bracelet, its cold surface digging into my palm. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had haunted me had vanished with the figure, but the oppressive feeling lingering in the air told me otherwise. I stumbled back toward the RV, my legs shaky and unsteady on the uneven terrain. The shadows cast by the towering canyon walls seemed to follow me, stretching unnaturally long in the fading sunlight. Every crunch of gravel underfoot, every gust of wind made me flinch, expecting the whispers or the skeletal figure to return. But they didn't. The desert was silent again, a silence that now felt more like a warning than a relief. When I reached the RV, the sight of its familiar shell should have comforted me, but instead, it filled me with dread. The scratches on the side were still there, deep gouges that served as a grim reminder of what had transpired. As I climbed inside and locked the door behind me, I felt no safer than I had in the open desert. The RV, once my refuge, now felt like a fragile cage, its thin walls no match for whatever forces I had just encountered. I collapsed into the small booth seat at the table, the bracelet still clutched in my hand. Staring at it, I couldn't stop the flood of memories that came rushing back. My sister's laughter, the way she'd proudly show off the bracelet to anyone who'd ask, her voice calling my name the day of the accident. A deep, aching guilt settled over me again, heavier than ever. The silence stretched on as night fell. Outside, the wind picked up, howling faintly through the cracks and crevices of the canyon, but it no longer carried whispers. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the figure, or something worse, was still out there, watching. My eyes darted to the windows repeatedly, half expecting to see a shadowy form pressed against the glass. Hours passed before I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my head resting on the table. The dreams came quickly, fragmented images of the canyon, the glowing carvings, and my sister's face. But the most vivid image was of the skeletal figure, its hollow eyes fixed on me as its hand reached out, not in rage this time, but in something that almost felt like sorrow. When I woke, it was to the faint glow of dawn creeping through the blinds. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I packed up the RV, preparing to leave Cathedral Gorge behind, I felt a presence, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. Even as I drove away, the sense of being watched clung to me, a shadow at the edge of my vision. And deep down, I knew it hadn't truly ended. The engine of the RV rumbled to life, a sound that should have brought comfort, but only amplified my unease. The morning light cast long beams across the canyon as I navigated the dusty road out of Cathedral Gorge, the rearview mirror reflecting the jagged rocks that had felt so otherworldly just hours before. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white. I told myself I was leaving it all behind, the whispers, the figure, the inexplicable terror, but the lingering heaviness in my chest said otherwise. The road stretched out before me, empty and winding, the kind of solitude I had sought when this journey began. But the loneliness no longer felt freeing. It felt like a trap. Every shadow on the horizon, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision sent my pulse racing. I had been so desperate for isolation, and now it felt like I was driving further into it, with no way to escape. I glanced into the side mirror, an irrational urge tugging at me to check if something or someone was following. The canyon walls loomed in the distance, silent and indifferent, but in the corner of the mirror a dark shape flickered. My breath caught, and I swerved slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I stared into the mirror, waiting, watching. There was nothing. For a long moment, I sat there, the engine idling, the silence of the desert pressing in around me. My eyes darted back to the bracelet lying on the dashboard, its silver charm catching the weak morning light. It felt heavier now, as though it carried a part of her, my sister, or perhaps something far more sinister. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the cool metal, and a chill ran up my spine. "This is over," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. I didn't know if I was trying to convince myself or something else. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I put the RV back into gear and pressed forward, the dusty road stretching endlessly ahead. But as the miles passed, the sense of being watched refused to fade. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a certainty, a primal instinct warning me that I wasn't alone. Every so often, in the corners of my vision, I saw it, a shadow flickering at the edge of the road, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. By the time I reached the highway, my exhaustion had turned into resignation. I knew I could leave Cathedral Gorge behind, but I couldn't escape what had found me there. It was with me now, an unseen presence, silent but suffocating. The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered like an echo in my mind. Even now, weeks later, I feel it. When I sit alone in the RV at night, when the wind howls outside, I see the shadow at the edges of my vision. It never moves closer, but it never leaves. Whatever I encountered in that canyon, it isn't done with me, and deep down, I know it never will be. Weeks passed, but the feeling of unease never left me. I tried to move on, driving further from Cathedral Gorge, staying at different campsites, but no matter where I went, it felt as though the shadow followed. The scratches on the RV, once an anomaly, began to multiply. Each morning I found new ones etched into the metal, long, deliberate, and unmistakably fresh. The nights were the worst. Even when the air was still, the RV creaked and groaned, as though something was shifting its weight on the roof or pressing against the walls. At first I told myself it was the wind, or the natural settling of the vehicle. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became harder to ignore the unnatural timing of the noises, always starting just as I began to drift off to sleep. One night, I decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and the wrench I kept for emergencies, I stepped outside into the cold night air. The desert was silent, the stars above bright and indifferent. I circled the RV, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no movement, just the stillness of the surrounding wilderness. But as I turned back toward the door, I felt it, a presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered briefly, plunging the world into darkness before the beam returned. That's when I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure stood at the edge of the campsite, just beyond the reach of the light. Its outline was sharp, unmistakable. Broad shoulders, a narrow face, and atop it, a wide-brimmed hat that seemed to absorb the starlight. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I shouted, the sound of my voice breaking the stillness like a crack of thunder. The figure didn't move. It stood there, utterly still, watching me. Or at least I thought it was watching. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt its gaze, cold and piercing, like it could see straight through me. Before I could muster the courage to step closer, the figure dissolved. One moment it was there, solid and imposing, and the next, it was gone, leaving only the empty desert behind. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart racing, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I finally retreated into the RV, I locked every latch and shut every blind. But no matter how many barriers I placed between myself and the outside, I knew it didn't matter. Whatever this was, it didn't need doors or windows to reach me. It was with me now. Always. The next morning, I found something new. On the window of the RV, written in the condensation from the cold night air, was a single word, leave. But where could I go that it wouldn't follow? The word leave lingered on the window like a brand burned into my mind. The faint streaks of condensation caught the morning light, making the letters glisten, but the message was clear. I wasn't welcome. Not here. Not anywhere. My hands trembled as I wiped the glass clean, but no amount of scrubbing could erase the dread crawling under my skin. I packed up quickly that morning, throwing my belongings into bags with little care for organization. The RV felt suffocating, as if its walls were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, that the shadowy figure, or something worse, was waiting just beyond the edges of my vision. Every step to the RV door felt like it might be my last. As I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered to life, its familiar rumble offering a momentary relief. But then, the radio crackled. I hadn't turned it on, yet static filled the cabin, sharp and insistent. My hand hovered over the dial, ready to switch it off, when a voice cut through the static. "Don't look back." The words were faint, distorted, but unmistakable. My heart stopped. It wasn't just a random broadcast, it was speaking directly to me. My pulse raced as I gripped the steering wheel, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. The RV jerked forward as I hit the gas, desperate to leave this place behind. The drive felt endless. The dirt road twisted through the barren landscape, the jagged cliffs casting long shadows in the rising sun. My eyes flicked constantly between the road and the mirrors, expecting to see something, anything, following me. But there was nothing, just the empty expanse of desert. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It clung to me like a second skin, a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. The radio crackled again, and the voice returned, louder this time. "Don't stop. Keep going." I gritted my teeth, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. The static hissed, filling the cabin like a living thing. Then, in a tone that was almost a whisper, the voice replied, "It's not done." Panic surged through me, and I pressed harder on the gas. The RV bounced over the uneven road, the scenery outside blurring into a haze of sand and rock. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What wasn't done? What did it want from me? I had done everything I could. I had faced the figure, apologized, offered the bracelet. What more could it want? In the rearview mirror, the shadow appeared again, impossibly large and looming. It didn't move, but its presence filled the space behind me, a black void that seemed to swallow the horizon. My heart raced as I forced my eyes back to the road, repeating the words I'd heard over the radio like a mantra. "Don't look back. Don't look back." But even as I drove, I knew the truth. It wasn't behind me. It was everywhere, and it wasn't done with me yet. The shadow lingered, a void etched into my mind even after it had disappeared from the mirror. Every mile I put between myself and the canyon felt hollow, like I was only spinning further into its web. The open desert stretched endlessly ahead, the rising sun offering little solace. Despite the warmth creeping through the RV's windows, the air inside was cold, unnaturally cold, like a deep chill emanating from somewhere unseen. I kept driving, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the dirt road my only companion. The radio had gone silent again, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. The static had felt intrusive before, but now its absence felt worse, as though the silence was a prelude to something far more terrifying. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles aching from the strain. The unease grew with every passing mile. The barren landscape outside seemed to shift subtly, the rocks casting shadows that didn't align with the position of the sun. Once or twice, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shape darting between the outcrops, but when I looked, there was nothing. I tried to focus on the road, to shake the growing paranoia, but the oppressive weight of being watched never left. As the hours wore on, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. The dirt road seemed endless, the same jagged rock formations rising and falling like a looping mirage. My GPS blinked uselessly, its signal lost somewhere in the vast emptiness. When I glanced at the odometer, my stomach dropped. Despite driving for hours, the mileage hadn't increased. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. The silence that followed was deafening. My chest heaved as I tried to calm my racing heart, but every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. I stepped out, the ground crunching under my boots, and scanned the horizon. Nothing but desert surrounded me. No signs of life, no landmarks, and no indication that I had moved at all. The whispers started again. Soft at first, carried on the wind like a distant echo, they grew louder, more insistent. Evan. My name, stretched and distorted, called out from nowhere and everywhere. I turned in a slow circle, my pulse pounding in my ears. You can't leave. The voices layered over one another, an overwhelming cacophony of accusation and malice. It's not over. You brought it with you. Panic set in, and I stumbled back toward the RV, my every step heavier than the last. As I reached for the door, I caught sight of the ground. There, in the dirt surrounding the RV, were footprints, no hoofprints. They were large, impossibly deep, and circled the vehicle as though something had been pacing impatiently. My blood ran cold. I climbed inside and locked the door, but the whispers only grew louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. Whatever this was, I couldn't escape it. Not now. Not ever. Inside the RV, the air was stifling despite the cool temperature. The whispers had become a constant presence now, an unrelenting chorus of voices filling every corner of the small space. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the door, clutching the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The interior lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I glanced toward the windows, but they reflected only the dim glow of the cabin. Yet in the corner of my vision, I could sense something moving just out of sight. My stomach churned as the whispers shifted, their tone no longer accusatory but commanding, insistent. It's time. You must face it. You brought it here. I shook my head violently, clamping my hands over my ears in a futile attempt to drown out the voices. No, I did what you wanted. I said I was sorry. I gave her the bracelet. My voice cracked, rising in pitch as desperation overtook me. But the voices didn't stop. They surged, drowning out even my own thoughts. Suddenly, the RV lurched violently, as if something massive had slammed into its side. I was thrown to the floor, my head striking the edge of the table. Dazed, I scrambled to my feet as the vehicle groaned under the strain of whatever was outside. The walls buckled inward slightly, and the roof creaked as though it might collapse at any moment. The lights went out completely, plunging the RV into darkness. Only the faint red glow of the emergency exit light remained, casting eerie shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight, its beam flickering weakly as I pointed it toward the windows. That's when I saw it. The shadowy figure stood just outside the glass, its towering form pressed against the side of the RV. The wide-brimmed hat obscured most of its face, but the faint glint of hollow sockets where eyes should have been sent a wave of terror through me. Its hand, skeletal and impossibly large, dragged slowly across the window, leaving streaks of condensation behind. The RV shook again, harder this time, and I heard the unmistakable sound of claws, or something worse, scraping against the metal exterior. I stumbled back, tripping over the table, as the whispers grew deafening. They were no longer words but a roar of pure sound, a vibration that rattled my very bones. Come out! The voice cut through the noise like a blade, low and guttural, filling the space with its command. You cannot run. You cannot hide. I pressed myself against the far wall, shaking my head as tears streamed down my face. Please, just leave me alone. My voice was barely a whisper, drowned out by the chaos around me. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping this. It had followed me here, and it would follow me wherever I went. The RV shook one final time, harder than ever, and then silence. Complete and utter silence. I opened my eyes, trembling, but the shadow was gone. Yet I could feel it, inside, around me, in the very air I breathed. It wasn't outside anymore, it was here. The RV's interior was bathed in a dim, eerie light, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My hands shook as I tried to steady myself, leaning against the counter, my mind racing. The whispers outside grew louder, almost rhythmic, as though chanting in some unknown language. I clutched the bracelet tighter in my fist, its cold metal biting into my palm. Suddenly, the RV shuddered violently, as though something massive had struck it. The sound of scraping metal filled the air, long and deliberate, sending shivers down my spine. I stumbled toward the front window, but the glass was fogged over, obscuring my view. The air inside grew colder, my breath visible as it clouded in front of me. My heart raced as I wiped the window with my sleeve, desperate to see what was out there. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the RV, shrouded in shadow, but unmistakable in its presence. This wasn't the skeletal figure I had encountered in the canyon. This was something else, something far more sinister. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form blending with the darkness around it. Two glowing eyes burned in its obscured face, piercing and malevolent, staring directly at me. The whispers shifted, becoming a singular voice, deep and resonant, echoing in my mind rather than my ears. "You cannot run from what you've unleashed." My knees buckled, and I collapsed into the seat behind me. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest as though the very space around me sought to suffocate me. The voice responded, calm but filled with undeniable authority. "You brought this upon yourself. Your grief, your guilt, they called to me. They gave me form. They gave me purpose." Tears streamed down my face as the weight of the words crushed me. The truth I had been avoiding for months now bore down on me with a relentless force. My grief over my sister's death, the guilt that I hadn't done enough, had festered inside me. It wasn't just a shadow following me, it was my shadow, a manifestation of the darkness I had carried since the day she died. How do I stop this? My voice cracked under the weight of desperation. How do I make it go away? The figure stepped closer, its presence filling the entire window, the glow of its eyes burning brighter. "You cannot erase what you are. You cannot undo what you have summoned. The only way forward is through." The RV groaned again, the walls seeming to close in as the entity loomed over me. I held the bracelet tighter, the metal now warm against my skin, as if pulsing with life. Somehow, I knew it was the key to ending this. But the whispers returned, louder than ever, drowning out all rational thought. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, and I knew I was running out of time. "Face it," the voice boomed, "or be consumed by it." Segment 13, The Final Confrontation, 500 words. The RV felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the walls groaning as if under immense pressure. The voice echoed louder, its tone commanding yet laced with malice. My hands trembled as I clutched the bracelet tighter, the warmth of the metal now burning against my palm. I didn't know how, but I felt it. This small object was my tether, my only chance to end this nightmare. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and I screamed back at them. "Enough! What do you want from me?" My voice was raw, desperate, but something shifted. The walls stopped creaking, and the oppressive cold lifted for a moment, replaced by an eerie stillness. Outside the window, the shadow figure remained, watching, waiting. Then the voice returned, clear and cutting. "Face what you fear most. Release what binds you." The bracelet. The answer was the bracelet. My sister's bracelet, the last connection I had to her, had become a prison for my grief and guilt. My refusal to let go, to forgive myself for what I couldn't change, had given form to this relentless entity. The RV shook violently as I stood, the bracelet held aloft in my trembling hand. The entity outside began to shift, its outline growing darker, more defined. Its glowing eyes locked onto me, as if daring me to act. "You can't take her from me," I whispered. But even as I said the words, I knew the truth. She was already gone, and holding on to this pain was destroying me. My sister wouldn't want this, wouldn't want me to carry this weight forever. With tears streaming down my face, I stepped to the door of the RV and flung it open. The desert air rushed in, cold and sharp, carrying the echoes of the whispers. The figure stood just beyond the threshold, its immense form blotting out the stars. I held the bracelet out toward it, my voice trembling but resolute. I let you go. I let her go. Take it and leave me. The figure moved slowly, its elongated arm reaching toward the bracelet. The moment its shadowy fingers touched the silver, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, the tension breaking like a thunderclap. The bracelet dissolved into the darkness, and with it the figure began to fade. Its glowing eyes dimmed, and its towering presence evaporated into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring into the empty desert, my body trembling with exhaustion. The night was silent now, the oppressive weight lifted. For the first time in months I felt lighter. As I stepped back inside the RV and locked the door, I knew the shadow was gone. But the memory of it, the truth it forced me to face, would stay with me forever. The RV's interior was bathed in a dim, eerie light, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My hands shook as I tried to steady myself, leaning against the counter, my mind racing. The whispers outside grew louder, almost rhythmic, as though chanting in some unknown language. I clutched the bracelet tighter in my fist, its cold metal biting into my palm. Suddenly, the RV shuddered violently, as though something massive had struck it. The sound of scraping metal filled the air, long and deliberate, sending shivers down my spine. I stumbled toward the front window, but the glass was fogged over, obscuring my view. The air inside grew colder, my breath visible as it clouded in front of me. My heart raced as I wiped the window with my sleeve, desperate to see what was out there. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the RV, shrouded in shadow, but unmistakable in its presence. This wasn't the skeletal figure I had encountered in the canyon. This was something else, something far more sinister. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form blending with the darkness around it. Two glowing eyes burned in its obscured face, piercing and malevolent, staring directly at me. The whispers shifted, becoming a singular voice, deep and resonant, echoing in my mind rather than my ears. You cannot run from what you've unleashed. My knees buckled, and I collapsed into the seat behind me. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice trembling. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest as though the very space around me sought to suffocate me. The voice responded, calm but filled with undeniable authority. You brought this upon yourself. Your grief, your guilt, they called to me. They gave me form. They gave me purpose. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of the words crushed me. The truth I had been avoiding for months now bore down on me with a relentless force. My grief over my sister's death, the guilt that I hadn't done enough, had festered inside me. It wasn't just a shadow following me, it was my shadow, a manifestation of the darkness I had carried since the day she died. How do I stop this? My voice cracked under the weight of desperation. How do I make it go away? The figure stepped closer, its presence filling the entire window, the glow of its eyes burning brighter. You cannot erase what you are. You cannot undo what you have summoned. The only way forward is through. The RV groaned again, the walls seeming to close in as the entity loomed over me. I held the bracelet tighter, the metal now warm against my skin, as if pulsing with life. Somehow, I knew it was the key to ending this. But the whispers returned, louder than ever, drowning out all rational thought. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, and I knew I was running out of time. Face it, the voice boomed, or be consumed by it. The days turned into weeks, and the open road became my sanctuary once again. I moved from one small town to the next, parking the RV in quiet campgrounds or on the edges of state parks. The freedom of solitude felt different now, less like an escape and more like a choice. The shadow had been left behind in Cathedral Gorge, or so I thought, but the feeling of being watched never truly disappeared. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror that was gone when I turned. The faint sound of footsteps outside the RV at night, too soft to be real, but too distinct to ignore. I told myself it was paranoia, the lingering effects of the ordeal I'd endured, but the signs grew harder to dismiss. One night, parked in the dense forests of Oregon's coast, I awoke to a familiar chill. The RV was dark, the air inside unnaturally cold. My breath fogged as I sat up, straining to hear. The whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable, curling through the silence like a distant echo. They weren't as loud or as insistent as before, but they were there, reminding me that I hadn't fully escaped. I climbed out of bed, flashlight in hand, and opened the door. The forest was still, the moonlight filtering through the trees in pale beams. My heart raced as I stepped outside, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then I saw it, a shape standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't the towering shadow figure or the skeletal apparition from the canyon. This figure was smaller, almost human in size, but distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. Its outline shimmered faintly, as though it weren't entirely solid, and its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to speak. "What do you want?" My voice was steady, though my hands shook. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, swirling around me. They weren't accusing this time, they were pleading. A single word emerged from the chaos, clear and chilling. "Remember." I blinked, and the figure was gone. The forest was quiet again, the whispers fading into the wind. My hands clenched the flashlight tightly as I backed into the RV and locked the door behind me. I sat in the driver's seat for the rest of the night, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to return. The next morning, I found another message, scrawled in condensation on the window. "Not done." I realized then that the shadow wasn't gone. It never would be. It wasn't tied to the canyon or the bracelet. It was tied to me. Wherever I went, it would follow. Not as a predator, but as a reminder. A reminder of the guilt, the grief, and the truth I had faced. And perhaps a reminder that some shadows are never truly left behind. The realization settled over me like a heavy fog. The shadow wasn't a threat I could outrun, nor was it something I could fight. It was part of me now, stitched into the fabric of my existence. Every time I thought I'd left it behind, it found a way to remind me it was still there, silent, watching, waiting. But the longer I stayed on the road, the more I began to understand what it truly meant. The shadow wasn't just some external force haunting me. It was the manifestation of everything I had avoided for so long. My guilt, my grief, and my refusal to forgive myself for my sister's death. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to make me remember, to confront what I had buried so deeply that it had turned into something I couldn't control. The next time I felt its presence, I didn't run. I was parked in a quiet clearing by a lake in Northern California, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The water was still, reflecting the pale light of the moon, and the air carried a faint chill that made my skin prickle. As I sat by the campfire, the familiar sensation crept over me, the weight of unseen eyes, the faint stir of whispers just beyond hearing. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe deeply, to stay grounded. "You're here," I said aloud, my voice steady. "I know you're here." The wind stilled, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the edge of the forest, the shadow emerged. It wasn't as large or as imposing as it had been before. Its outline was softer, less defined, like it was losing the sharp edges of its malice. It stood there, silent, watching, as it always did. I stared at it, the fear that had gripped me so tightly now replaced with something else. Acceptance. "I can't change what happened," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't save her. I wasn't enough, but I can't keep punishing myself for it. I need to let her go." The shadow didn't move, but the whispers shifted, softening into a faint hum. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small charm I'd kept hidden since the day I left Cathedral Gorge. It wasn't the bracelet, but a piece of it. A single silver link I'd found after the rest had dissolved. I held it up toward the shadow, my hands steady. "This is all I have left," I whispered. "Take it." The shadow didn't reach for it. Instead, it simply faded, melting into the darkness of the forest. The whispers stopped, replaced by the gentle rustle of the trees in the breeze. The weight lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt free. As the fire crackled softly, I looked out at the lake, its surface calm and unbroken. The shadow might never truly leave me, but in that moment, I knew I could live with it, and for the first time, I wanted to try. The morning after my final encounter with the shadow felt like waking from a long, restless dream. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the lake and the surrounding forest in hues of gold and green. The air smelled of damp pine and fresh earth, a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating stillness I had grown used to. For the first time in months, I felt like I could truly breathe. I packed up the RV slowly, savoring the quiet moments of the morning. There was no rush, no lingering dread pushing me to flee. As I loaded the last of my belongings, I glanced at the small silver link sitting on the counter. It felt lighter now, no longer a burden, but a reminder, a piece of the past that I had finally made peace with. I slipped it into my pocket, not as a weight to carry, but as a token of what I had overcome. The road stretched out before me, winding through the towering pines and disappearing into the distance. As the RV rumbled to life, I felt a twinge of nervousness, a small part of me wondering if the shadow might return. But the forest seemed peaceful, untouched by the presence that had haunted me for so long. Driving felt different now. The open road wasn't an escape anymore. It was an invitation, a chance to start again. I had spent so much time running, trying to outrun my grief, my guilt, and the manifestations of those feelings. But now I felt ready to face the journey ahead, wherever it might lead. As the miles passed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The shadow, the whispers, the unexplainable phenomena. They had all been terrifying, but they had also forced me to confront parts of myself I had been too afraid to face. The shadow wasn't my enemy, it was my mirror, showing me the parts of myself I needed to accept and release. By midday, I reached a small town nestled in a valley, its streets lined with quaint shops and cafes. The sight was comforting in its normalcy, a reminder that the world was still turning, unchanged by the storms I had weathered. I parked the RV at a quiet lot on the outskirts of town and decided to explore. The people were friendly, the kind of strangers who smiled and nodded as you passed. I found myself drawn to a small bookstore tucked into the corner of the main street. Inside, the scent of old paper and coffee was a soothing balm. As I browsed the shelves, I stumbled upon a journal, a simple, leather-bound book that called to me. Without hesitation, I bought it. Later that evening, as the sun set over the town, I sat at the RV's small table and opened the journal to its first blank page. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but the words came easily. "This is where it begins again," I wrote, and for the first time in a long while, I believed it. The night after I started writing felt different, as if putting my thoughts onto paper had lifted another invisible weight from my shoulders. The journal sat open on the RV table, its blank pages waiting for more. I stared at it, pen in hand, realizing how far I'd come, not just in miles but in understanding. The shadow, the whispers, the fear, they weren't just reminders of my guilt. They were lessons, forcing me to confront the parts of myself I had been too afraid to face. I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin. Above me, the stars were scattered across the sky like glittering fragments of something broken but still beautiful. For the first time in months, I let myself enjoy their brilliance, without searching for movement in the shadows. The world felt quiet, peaceful, and though I knew the shadow might never truly leave me, I no longer felt its weight pressing down on me. Sitting by the RV, I thought about my sister. Her laugh, her voice, the way she could light up a room with just a smile. For so long, I had carried the guilt of her death, convinced that I hadn't done enough to save her. But out here, under the vast expanse of the universe, I realized something. She wouldn't want me to live like this. She wouldn't want her memory to be a source of pain. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver link I had kept from her bracelet. It felt warm in my hand, almost alive, a symbol of everything I had clung to. I stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, where a gentle breeze rustled the trees. "I'll never forget you," I whispered, holding the link up to the sky. "But it's time for me to let go." I placed the link on a rock and stepped back, watching as the breeze carried the surrounding leaves in a quiet dance. I stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of my grief lift just a little more. It wasn't gone, and maybe it never would be, but it was lighter, easier to carry. When I returned to the RV, I felt different, stronger, freer. I picked up the journal again and began to write, pouring everything out onto the pages. The fear, the whispers, the shadow, and the lessons they had taught me. Writing didn't erase the past, but it gave it meaning, a way to make sense of everything I had been through. As I lay in bed that night, I heard the faintest sound, like a whisper carried on the breeze. But it wasn't the same as before. It was soft, kind, almost comforting. I closed my eyes, a small smile tugging at my lips. Tomorrow, the road would stretch on, and I would keep going. Not running, not escaping, but living. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready.